Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hi and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. There was once a time when defining someone's social class was probably quite easy. You tended to fall into one of three categories.
I look down on him because I am upper class.
I look up to him because he is upper class. But I look down on him because he is lower class. I am middle class. I know my place.
But now it's become a lot more complex, and so my guest for this episode was Dr. Mike Savage from the London School of Economics. You may be aware of Mike's work. He's probably best known for his contributions on the Great British Class Survey. You may have even done that online. And also his book, Social Class in the 21st Century. And Mike points to the fact that whereas in the past we had the three-class system, the upper, middle and working class, today things are a little bit more complex and we have a seven-class tier system. And so without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Thank you for talking to the Sociology Show podcast. Would you start by introducing yourself, please?
Okay, so I'm Mike Savage. I'm Professor of Sociology at London School of Economics.
Thank you, Mike. And what's your history in sociology, Mike? Where did it all start for you?
Well, it's a curious story because I was born in 1959, went to school in the 60s and 70s. And I actually went to a school in Merton in southwest London, which Merton was one of the first local authorities in the country to go comprehensive in the early 70s. And as part of, and they went comprehensive in a very, very kind of, modernising utopian spirit. They really wanted to improve the quality of education for all their school kids. And part of this, interestingly, was that they championed teaching sociology in the early 70s, which was very unusual. So I did an O-level GCSE in sociology in 1975, it would have been. And I think at that point it was very, very rare. So, yeah, and actually I looked at my exam certificate the other day and I got an A for it, better than any other result, in fact. But having said that, I then dropped sociology and did a degree in history, did a master's degree in history too, and only then switched back to sociology to do my PhD. So it's an interesting story of kind of going in and going out.
So you must have been one of the first to do sociology. Was that one of the first O-levels at that time?
I think I was one of the first, yeah. And it's funny, I still have memories of the lessons. I remember looking at the Registrar General's approach to social class, in some ways, I was age 16, things haven't changed that much.
And when you did that O-level, what really kind of grabbed your interest? Was there a particular theory or sociologist that really sparked your interest at that time? At
that point, the syllabus was quite conventional, quite old-fashioned. So you had functionalist theories of the family. You had a focus around social class that was there. I don't remember a massive amount about it, but I do remember, being interested in the topic and finding it intriguing to think about the nature of social inequality and social class. And then, for people that don't know, I'm sure a lot of listeners are aware of your work. And tell us about your own studies and what your main focus of research is all about. Well, I suppose going back to that experience, but also, growing up in a kind of, I grew up in London suburbia, a middle-class family. My dad was a journalist. My mum was housewife when I was growing up and then became a secretary later on. And in a funny kind of way, issues about class and equality were always there. And always became aware of kind of, what kind of class were we in. My parents were quite political, so they talked about that a bit. I remember during the 1970s, all the coal miners' disputes and the industrial conflict at the time was something we talked about. So I've always been interested in that sense about how societies are structured by inequality, how social divisions are endemic, and what that means And, from being an undergraduate, I was very influenced by Marxism, and, I saw myself as really influenced and inspired by the Marxist way of thinking about class and exploitation. And that has really informed all my work in a way. I mean, I initially began studying the working class, trying to understand history of the labour movement, the way in which the working classes were a radical social group. But actually, as I moved on, I've become increasingly interested in kind of the shift of inequality towards the top and what's happening at the top levels of society. So in the 1990s, I became interested in the middle classes, and then also more recently in the people who are very privileged and powerful and prosperous and what they're doing. So there's always been underpinning sense about inequality, I think. But I've looked at it in different kinds of ways. And I've always been also concerned not to see class as somehow a kind of the overarching factor. I've always been keen to explore how it overlaps with gender inequality, racial inequality to some extent, also local inequality, and kind of trying to get to grips with the feel of inequality on the ground. And part of that has always also been about criticising purely economic models of class. So I think sociologists play a huge role because we are actually able to look at the experience of inequality, how people feel about inequality. And I'll be very concerned always to think about how we can understand that best.
And people may know you from your involvement in the Great British Class Survey.
So, yes, we began working on the Great British Class Survey in about 2009. And that was a project which the BBC asked me and Fiona Devine, the University of Manchester, to lead. And they asked us to develop these questions around social class for a web survey they were launching. It's one of those strange things. I was never quite sure if it was a serious imitation or whether it's just a kind of, slightly maverick request which would be parked and nothing would happen to it. So, we were surprised when they actually really got behind it and put a lot of resources into designing a survey, a lot of resources into kind of making it attractive and popular. We got a very large response from the British public who were watching the BBC, and that gave us a huge digital web survey database, which allowed us to think about class in a new way. What was distinctive about our work was that we were trying to measure class not just in terms of your employment or your occupation, but also in terms of your cultural capital. So here we were influenced by Pierre Bourdieu, and your social capital, your social networks. So we really had this emphasis about a multi-dimensional approach to class. That class couldn't be boiled down to one thing. It was the amalgam, the crystallization of different sorts of capitals. And that led us to develop this model of 7 classes, which became discussed massively when the BBC launched the findings in 2013.
Yeah, and I remember doing it myself. Is it about 7 million people completed it in the end? Was that the number?
Well, yeah, so there was a web survey, which is about 20 minutes, got a lot of detail in it, and that was about a third of a million people did that. But when the results came out, the BBC also developed an online quiz, much shorter, much more, not as accurate in a way. And that's still live. So if you Google, you can still find it on very easily online. And that allows you to punch in a few answers. It approximates what class you're in. And that has been done by about 9 million people.
Oh, wow.
So it's extremely successful.
Yeah. And you mentioned the 7-class system. That's what I really want to get into the meat of at some point. But before we do how class might be looked at now, I know your work kind of says that social class was perhaps easier to define in the past. So how was social class defined maybe in the 50s and 60s before we get into the 7-point plan?
Yeah, so conventionally, sociologists have understood class as to do with your occupation and your employment. And it's to do with, and so that you could therefore boil it down to basically what job you did, really.
Yeah. And
conventionally in sociology, but not just in sociology, also in popular attitudes, class was about big difference between manual workers and non-manual workers. So it was often assumed that the big distinction was between whether you're middle class, white collar, office worker, you work with your brain rather than your hands, or whether you were a manual worker. And that's kind of very crude perspective. It was modified. It was sort of adapted by people like John Goldthorpe, but fundamentally it kept as the dominant way of thinking about class until the 21st century. And of course, it's still around today. And it's a very powerful way of thinking about class. I think it resonates with our feelings of how our life is defined by our jobs, Same time, it has a number of issues. One of them is that many people don't have a job. Old people, kids, people are ill, disabled, people are doing caring work. How do you fit them into this model? Society has become complex. As we've seen the decline of manual work and the rise of various kinds of white-collar professional jobs, we need to have better understanding of what's happening amongst those kinds of expanding white-collar technical professional jobs. And we need to think about class not just about your occupation, but also about how you feel, your identities, your values, and possibly they can be linked into your occupation, but not all of them can be. When we think about class, we often think about respect, we think about stigmatization, we think about feeling disempowered. These things can't necessarily be boiled down to your occupational class.
Yeah. So in your own measurement, it's not just economic capital, it's social and cultural as well. Is that right?
So that was it. So we drew obviously upon the sociology of Pierre Bourdieu, who has been increasingly significant in shaping debate about social inequality. And his emphasis is that, yes, the economic dimension is crucial. We know that. We know that, how much money you have, how much wealth you have is a very, very important feature. But your life isn't just shaped by those things. And so he introduces this notion of cultural capital, which is bound up in how you see the world. It's bound up in your lifestyles, your interests. And I think Bourdieu's really important point is that it's much more difficult to grasp this aspect of class inequality, but in some respects it's more salient than economic inequality. That is to say, if you can imagine winning the lottery, and you can have winning £1 million, you then do have money to spend. But cultural capital isn't something you can just win like that. It has to be steeped in the way, in your education, in the way you're brought up, in the way you dress, in the way you talk. And therefore it's really enduring and really difficult to shift, to Bourdieu's point. So actually the inequalities we learn around cultural capital are, very, very pervasive and not something which can be changed or challenged simply by redistributing income. So we wanted to bring that into the debate, and also what Bourdieu talks about around social capital, social networks. Do you know influential people? Can they help you? Is there an old boys club? All these sorts of things. And we had measures of all these three kinds of capital, and we then saw how they link together, and that led us to our 7 classes.
Great. So let's have a look at those 7 classes. I thought what we'd do is maybe start looking at the top and the bottom, because they're perhaps the easiest to define, and then it gets more difficult and complex within the middle. So let's start from the top. Number 1's the elite, is that right? So how would you define elite? Yeah,
so this is quite a, this is quite a distinctive and important argument, I think, because conventionally, most sociologists had not talked about elites as a class. They talked about professional managerial classes, upper classes, but we really wanted to bring into focus the fact that a significant group of people were characterised by simply being so much better off than anybody else. And so here, in a way, we're obviously overlapping with the work of economists who've shown the same thing, that big trend in the last 30 years has been the rise of top incomes, people who have paid lots of money. And in our analysis, we had a big web survey. We also had a smaller national survey. We were able to kind of only roughly approximate how big these classes were. We reckoned about 7% of people were extremely affluent. They had average incomes, average household incomes of around £100,000 after tax. So this is really very serious, significant, very serious stuff. And so for us, what class structure is seeing is it's seeing the pulling away of people with high amounts of economic capital. And then at the bottom, if I can move to the bottom, we then had a group called the precariat. And the precariat were the complete opposite of the elite, in that they had a very little economic resource. Really important to recognise they're not people who are on the whole, unemployed or welfare dependents, benefit dependents. They often had jobs, but they're precarious ones, insecure ones, badly paid. And so our model of class really had these two extremes, rather than there being a big divide between middle and working class, which is a characteristic approach in sociology. We have these kind of two extreme groups. But then, as you say, in the middle, it's a bit more fuzzy. So we had a group which we called the established middle class. It's quite a large group, around a quarter of the population, we reckon. And this is, these are people who have, well educated, often working in the professions, management, securely, very secure, very nice, comfortable position, but ultimately without the resources of the elite. So you really want to distinguish, the established middle classes from the people above them who are just paid a lot more. But then we also found some groups who were paid quite a lot of money, had reasonable incomes, but didn't have cultural capital or social capital in the same way. So there's a group which we call new affluent workers who weren't so well educated, didn't have so much cultural capital, but they were in reasonably affluent jobs. And similarly, a group we found very interesting, which we call the technical middle class, who, again, were often in technical jobs, scientific jobs, often in IT. And they were pretty well off. Not as well off as the elite, but they were pretty well off. But what was very striking about them is they were, they had very few social networks, very little social capital. And we sort of characterize these as being like geeks. You can imagine the kind of, IT, the stereotyped IT, operator who's obsessed by his computer. And in a way, this notion about some middle class groups who've got this obsession with technology and gadgets, it rings a chord. So we were saying, the middle class are quite fragmented. There are different groups in the middle class, and they have different levels of economic, social, and cultural capital. And then we went further down the class structure, and we found a group which we call the traditional working class. So this is a group who are better off than precariat, generally, had a bit more money, also had some, more likely to own a home, more likely to have reasonable social networks. They were very distinctive because they tend to be much older than the precariat or other groups in the middle classes. And therefore, they had quite a distinctive demographic. And finally, there was a group which attracted quite a lot of interest called the emerging service workers. This is a category of people, mainly young people who've been to university or were well educated, so lots of cultural capital, but they did not have good careers, did not have good job prospects, were not well paid. And so there's a mismatch between their economic capital and their cultural capital, which is quite striking. This is a kind of younger generation of people who've kind of been locked out of the high-paying jobs of the 21st century. So really what this ends up with, its approach, is to say we can distinguish groups, particularly in the middle, and we can see them not as lumping together, but really as quite distinctive according to their particular amount of economic, social, and cultural capital. And we've got to distinguish those different categories. But that's within the overall perspective about how the top and the bottom are so different. So one of the points we make is that if we have to find one dividing line, we've got 7 classes, but okay, what is the most important class division out of those 7? Then, it's undoubtedly the one at the top. Yeah. Undoubtedly the one where it's the elite from the rest. And I think that's an important point to make, given the world we live in and given the nature of social inequality today.
And did you say around 7% probably fall into the elite?
Yeah, about 7%. And, as people pointed out, as critics pointed out, we only had a small national survey of about 1,000 people compared to the Big Web survey, which we couldn't generalise from because there's a big sample scheme on that survey. So, we don't want to fixate on 7%. It could be 10%, it could be 5%. But we did want to make the point, because economists have talked a lot about the 1%. 1% of being people who are, really, really well off. And of course they're right. I mean, the 1% have done really well, but it's not just the 1%. It's a significant group of people who we wanted to put into this category.
And you mentioned a percentage for there. How does the rest of it stagger? Is there one particular group that's bigger than the others? Is it still the traditional working class make up the largest percentage?
So I think the elite were the smallest, as you might expect. Yeah. But I think the biggest was actually the established middle class. The solid middle class, 25% or so, and the others are between those two extremes. So it's normally about 10, 12, 15%. So it's not as if there's one class which dominates. There's actually a sort of a mosaic, if you like, of different classes.
Great, thank you, Mike. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, I'm going to ask you a few more questions and also move on to the topic of social mobility. Okay, welcome back to part 2. I'm talking to Mike Savage about the issue of social class. Social mobility, Mike, big question. I know you've been talking about social mobility has actually declined or decreased. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it's a very contentious topic, social mobility, and different kinds of arguments about whether it's declining or staying the same or possibly even rising. A lot depends on how you measure it. The measurement involves partly, what groups you're looking at mobility between, and also kind of, whether you're looking at your chances of moving up and down. It's sometimes called absolute mobility. What are your chances of moving up or moving down or staying the same? How is that changing over time? But also, sociologists like John Gold will emphasise what they call relative mobility. That is to say, not just your chances of moving up or down or staying the same, but what your chances are compared to somebody else in a different class. So here, your prospects are seen to be relative to other people's prospects. And basically, you get different arguments about whether mobility is declining if you take those different perspectives. So if you look at the issue of absolute mobility, that is to say, what are your chances of moving up or moving down the social class system compared to your parents? That has gone up and gone down. The reason it went up in the years after the Second World War was because there were a lot more jobs to move into. So there were a lot more professional jobs, managerial jobs. And that by itself created a structural process whereby there was room at the top for people to move upwards. And so there was a clear tendency for working class kids, working class lads particularly, to be upwardly mobile into those sorts of jobs. What, of course, has happened in the last 20 years is that process has slowed down because, the expansion of those jobs has declined a bit. And what has become more evident in recent years is another factor is that there are more parents, if you like, working in middle class jobs, and so therefore there are more kids being brought up in middle class families than there used to be. That just by itself means that the prospects of some of those middle class kids moving down the social hierarchy is increased. So the evidence, if you look at absolute mobility, is now the rate of mobility hasn't changed that much probably, but more kids are moving down now than moving up, because that partly reflects the fact that there are more kids who are born into more privileged families than used to be the case. If you look at relative mobility rates, that is to say your chances of moving compared to other people in other classes, this is a very technical discussion, but in Britain it would appear there hasn't been much change, particularly for men. For women, perhaps there's been a slight improvement, but not very substantial. And that reflects the fact that, the relative advantages of middle-class kids over working-class kids have remained the same, whatever the changes to the economy and the wider social structure. Having said that, it also depends a bit on how fine-grained you look. And so my colleague Sam Friedman at the LSE has done this very interesting project on the class ceiling, where what they did is they looked into particular occupations. So they really mined down to great detail, looking at who becomes a doctor, who becomes a lawyer, who becomes a journalist, and so forth. And what they found was basically, if you do that and go right down to the occupational level, and you find the most privileged occupations, like being a doctor, being a lawyer, in those jobs you do tend to get more reproduction of middle class kids. So the high proportion of doctors come from upper middle class backgrounds, and they also found out that those doctors with the highest incomes tended to be even more likely to come from those backgrounds. So it depends on what level you're looking at, but on the whole, the evidence suggests that particularly at the top, privileged kids tend to get those jobs.
Yeah. And it will come as no surprise, I'm sure, but in social class in the 21st century, you talk about the gap between the bottom and the top becoming wider and wider. What's your research show as to why that is the case?
Yeah, so as you say, that's the big theme that we're seeing is pulling apart the top classes from the middle classes and from the people at the bottom, the working class or the precariat. And here I think the work of the economists is really very significant. And that book was written partly on the back of the economist Thomas Piketty, who, with other colleagues of his, has shown how in many countries, the US being one example, but UK being another one, the last 30 years has really seen this big expansion of top incomes. So basically, people whose incomes have really gone up rapidly have been people in the most privileged jobs earning the highest amount of money. The reasons for that are partly to do with taxation policy. So both in the UK and the US in the 80s, marginal tax rates for high earners were cut quite substantially. It's also to do with the fact that firms are prepared to pay, a high premium to get the so-called best employees, and so you find a growing tendency for kind of what's sometimes called superstar salaries. Also to do with the breakdown of collective bargaining, trade unions becoming weaker, the rise of the private sector, small firms, who are more able to kind of pay market rates. So a whole series of processes have allowed high earners to do really well, and that has driven, I think, the success of the elite. And we, in terms of social mobility into that elite, that is very likely. We didn't have brilliant data to look at social mobility in that study, but I think the work of Sam Friedman and others have shown that that is allowing kids or privileged parents to enjoy extra advantages. Think about private tutors. Think about helping kids with super resources, taking them to the theatre. There's always been those advantages, but arguably they're getting even more marked. And so I think we can expect this tendency for elites to be doing increasingly well to increase.
So, there's definitely evidence that the rich have got richer, if you like. Have the poor got poorer, though? Because obviously things like living conditions, sanitation and so on, they have improved in the last 50 years. So is it just the gaps getting bigger rather than the poor getting poorer?
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of research about what's happening at the bottom end. Is poverty increasing? In terms of how you measure poverty, of course, UK still has, benefits which try and keep extreme poverty, away from people. It stops people falling to extreme poverty most of the time. And I think the evidence shows that under the Labour government in the early 2000s, with policies like tax credits and policies towards benefit payments, there was actually a slight improvement of poverty.
Yeah.
So poverty was reduced in those years. Since 2008, with the politics of austerity, that has shifted a bit. Wouldn't say it's massively increased, but it certainly hasn't improved substantially. So you're absolutely right. What the big driver isn't so much about what's happening at the bottom; it's more about what's happening at the top. Big shift.
Yeah, and one of the phrases you use is about London becoming a vortex, which I found quite interesting.
Yeah, so again, one of the advantages of the Great British Class Survey was that we had a very, very large sample size, 1/3 people, which meant we could do some very detailed geographical mapping where people from different classes lived. And you often can't do that using surveys because you haven't got enough cases to mine down into great detail. But we were able to do this. And it was just really, really striking how much of the elite were based in London and the southeast of England. That partly reflects the fact, of course, that one of our measures of economic capital was the value of your house. As we know, the London housing market is much more expensive, much more pricey than anywhere else in the UK. And people sometimes say, well, it's therefore just to do with the fact that people in London have expensive houses. But of course, let's not forget that though if you own a house, that is an asset. And it does allow people in those locations to potentially benefit from that asset in a way which isn't possible if you're living in a different part of the country. So we were very fascinated by the fact that high earners, people with a high amount of economic capital, were located predominantly in London and the southeast, but also it wasn't just economic capital which was clustered in that area. It was also educational capital, cultural capital. So we found the universities where you were most likely to earn the highest income. I say the universities which gave you the greatest premium on your average pay tended to be, they were entirely in London and South East, so in Oxford and Cambridge and the London colleges, LSE, Imperial and so forth. And similarly, social networks, very privileged in London. So there's a whole series of reinforcing circuits, whereby London is a kind of, a special area, if you like, where elite people meet other elite people, they know each other, develop social contacts, the best jobs are there, and it creates this kind of vortex effect whereby, you're in a bubble. But of course, London's also very divided. Plenty of people aren't in that bubble, and they're cut out of it. And similarly too, the geographical divide between north and south of England, between London and the southeast versus the rest, which has always been there. I think it's not new in itself. It has become more marked. And, I think when we look at some of the political changes, the vote against staying in the EU, Brexit referendum, you can see those inequalities and those differences taking a very marked form.
Thanks, Mike. And is it true that a lot of people, when they did the survey, they either disagreed with or they didn't like the category that they actually came out at?
Yeah. And I think that's interesting. That was interesting. Yeah. So when we publicised the research results, and the BBC really pushed the work out there. It was very exciting, but it was very interesting. Two things. One of them was people were very interested in it. So it got a lot of media interest.
Yeah.
As sociologists, I spent a lot of my time interviewing people, and sometimes you're aware you ask questions and people don't really care, and they're having to give you an answer which, because they're being asked to give an answer, doesn't really mean much to them. In class, it does provoke a nerve. When you talk about class, in Britain at least, it's a bit different in other countries. In Britain, it means something. People have something to say about class. At the same time, people don't like putting themselves in a class. So people like talking about class inequalities, and they like talking about, people in other classes, people different from them. But if you then say, okay, and how do you see yourself belonging to the classes, people would often be ambivalent. When people did this class calculator, which you can still do online, it was very, very common for people to say, these ridiculous sociologists, they put me in this class, I'm not in that. Of course, it varied a bit which class they were being put in. So people who were in the elite were they might post things on Facebook saying, oh, I'm not really in the elite, but obviously they partly, but quite pleased, I think. But people who, so people enjoyed the exercise of thinking about classes, but they didn't like being classed, if you like what I mean, because that seemed to be locating them in a particular box, and they wanted to present themselves as, much more complex than that. So it shows a very interesting process in modern Britain whereby we recognise inequality and we see class divisions all around us, but we don't find it that easy to talk about ourselves as being part of that class system.
And did you say you can still do that online at the moment? If so,
yeah,
where
so
can
if
you find it? Yeah.
If you Google BBC class calculator, it should come up there, and you should then lead on to a questionnaire, which you can answer a few questions. It will tell you what class you're supposed to be in, and that's good fun. It's a fun thing to do. People enjoy doing it.
Right. And I've got one question from a student as well.
Okay.
If you had a working class lad who became a Premier League footballer, earning a huge sum of money, where would they sit in the 7-class system?
Well, in our model, it doesn't matter what your background was. It matters how much you're earning, and it matters how much social, cultural capital you have. The chances are, if that Premier League footballer is earning a lot of money, that would bring them. That's enough to bring them into the elite, even if their social capital and cultural capital wasn't as high. Economic capital can trump all the other ones if it's very, very extreme. But so you'd have to see in his particular case. But I imagine that would be true.
Great. And were there any particular occupations that were quite difficult to categorise? Actually, I was just thinking about that.
The job which I always found, and the one which I always enjoyed, was the fact that airline pilots were particularly likely to be in this technical middle class. That's the class of people who get paid a lot of money, but they don't have much social networks. And you can imagine why, if they're sitting in an airport. Apart from talking to air traffic control, they wouldn't necessarily have many contacts. So in some ways, it does fit intuitively to some extent.
Right. Thanks, Mike. And you've already mentioned where you can do the class calculator. Where can people read more about? You've got the book Social Class in the 21st Century.
So I would say the book, which is a Penguin book, Social Class 21st Century, is the best. I would say this, of course. It's not too expensive. It is affordable, I think.
Right, and that's also got the contributions from some of the other sociologists like Sam Friedman you mentioned as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, so a number of us worked on the project together. Fiona Devine, Sam Friedman, Niall Cunningham, who did a lot of the geographical mapping work. Daniel Lauriston, he helped with a lot of the quantitative work. Helen Snay, who now works at Manchester Metropolitan University, did a lot of interviews. Someone called Lisa McKenzie. Got anything? Paul Wakeling.
Right, thank you, and thank you for mentioning Lisa McKenzie and Sam Friedman, because they've previously done episodes on the Sociology Show, so listeners can go back and listen to those episodes if they've not already done so. Dr. Mike Savage, thank you very, very much for your time today.
That's okay, thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.